Hello out there, I'm Mr. O'Donnell, and today we're talking about animation. What does animation even mean, first off? Well, the word simply means to bring life to something, to animate something. Frankenstein was reanimated, something that was alive and you brought it back. So, what we usually think of animation, though, is something that's drawn by, used to be a hand or maybe by a computer. But today in this lesson, we're all going to be talking about the history of animation, where animation's gone, and ways in which that actually you can start thinking about doing some of your own animation. So first off, really, what is animation? What we've been talking about genres. Animation isn't necessarily isn't even a genre at all. It really is more about a technique. They're individual drawings and paintings and illustrations, and basically you have an image, and then you have a second image that is just slightly different from the first one. And from one of these pictures, one of these drawings, or we're going to refer to them as frames, from one frame to the next, if you move them slightly from one to another, it gives the illusion of movement. And I want you to be able to focus on that idea, that it really is illusion. It is a trick. The idea that nothing is actually moving, but by having these images that are very close from one to the next one gives that sense that something is actually moving. When they put them in rapid succession, then the faster the animation is. And when you think about animation, here's a shot from Bambi you can see here, and how many frames that you have, or how many images. The magic recipe that we really kind of focus on is 24. If you could have 24 images that can be put in 1 second, so think about that, 1,000. 24 separate images really gives kind of a lifelike feeling of something being animated. And sort of that's kind of the magic number that you kind of want to be able to work for when you do this. But it's more than necessarily just a technique. When we say, what is animation? It's a technique. Is it a genre, though? Well, really, when you think of it, when you think of animation, what an animation was, particularly you guys as teenagers, the idea that it has always been fairy tales and cartoons and stop motion films, really sort of appealing to children. But that would be that would marginalize them to just say this is always just children's entertainment, particularly where we've gone today with animation. But let's go back a little bit to sort of the beginning of animation. In the very beginning, when the idea about how to be able to put one thing to the next and create that illusion, it was really more interested by people from a scientific perspective, really more than really kind of what would we envision it as entertainment today. That illusion of something moving. So we're actually going to talk about this guy right here. His name is Leland Stanford. He was the governor of California, and you all know him, yes, as the name behind the University of Stanford. And he loved horses. And so when he saw this, he's sitting there watching his horses run out in the field and fascinated by the movement of the horse. And a question that people would talk about, they move so fast. Is there at any point that a horse is completely off the ground, or all 4 hooves off at one time? By looking at a horse running, it's difficult to tell. And so he tasked somebody. He said, hey, do they all come off? And so the question that he put out, he gave it to somebody and said, hey, can you kind of prove this for me? And so this went way deeper than what was originally anticipated. But the person who was tasked on doing this started this scientific process of trying to capture every frame of a horse running. And as you can see here, it looks like they're in frame number 3 that, yeah, all those hooves are off the ground. And so that was able to prove the point. It was way more money spent on this experiment than was originally envisioned as just simply kind of a trick. But that idea of being able to put a bunch of images together created this. And this was really interesting. So beyond the idea of what the horse was talking about was really the idea is that I'm watching some moving images. And that's really kind of what we think about today. If you go to the movies, they're often, the original term was called motion pictures. And that's what they were there. So earlier these, I mentioned science, some of these ways in which you could view these moving images. You can see there was a bunch of them here. Probably one of the most famous of them is the zoetrope there in the middle. But by using slits and spinning discs and mirrors and spinning them and giving the illusion that something is moving, like you can see in the middle one, the zoetrope, the horses right there. But sooner after a while, it's going to move beyond science and moving more towards this idea of some sort of entertainment. Still a novelty, though. These early drawings about, you would go into what was called a Nickelodeon, and you'd put your head into a machine, and you'd be able to see short little snippets like this. Here's one of the first ones that really quite popular here. This is called Gertie the Dinosaur, and very similar to like what you saw with the horse there. Very rude, simple animation. But the year there, look at that. Remember, for those of you who studied back into World War One, that's the year that the World War One started. So animation is really kind of a 20th century phenomenon just within these 100 years. But a lot of things have happened in these 100 years. More than anything else, the person that is the game changer of animation is this guy. He's born outside Chicago. He bounces around the Midwest, and you can see here some of his early cartoon work as a newspaper cartoonist. Here he is in Kansas City, Missouri. But he decides, hey, listen, I'm going to go ahead to California, and I'm going to try to be able to make something more myself in the cartoon animation world. You probably don't recognize him over there, but if we change a little bit of a facial hair, like here, you can see, yes, this person's name is Walter, and Walter Disney. He comes to California with his brother, and you could say like he sort of reinvents this animation, but I would say it's even more profound than that. He invents animation as we know it. We all sort of know him as Disneyland and Mickey Mouse, but it really is so much more of what happens. But Mickey Mouse is an integral part of it. This is a huge breakthrough. He had done several shorts before this, but using this character, Mickey Mouse, in this famous movie called Steamboat Willie, did several things. First off, it made this character somebody. Like here it is, this mouse that you can relate to, but it's more than the animation that you saw with the mouse. It was sound. And let's listen here as I click on this. I want you to be able to listen to the sound from Steamboat Willie. Now, much like what Talkies did and how they basically destroyed the silent movie era, and it was a whole game changer, that is what kind of Steamboat Willie is going to do. It gives us Mickey Mouse, but more, it's the integration of sound and music together, which is going to propel animated films. And to this day, there's still this a wonderful marriage between those two, between what you're hearing as well. Throughout early Mickey, you can see that music was very integral to the success of Mickey Mouse, and people were fascinated. They wanted to be able to not necessarily just go see, but hear the music that was playing. Audiences were just enamored by this. And Disney has continued this with the mouse for sure, too. Mickey has gone hand in hand with music. So many of the films have him animating musical objects. And even if you look at here, this classic 1950s television show which they put on the Mickey Mouse Club with that famous song at the end, which many of you probably have not seen the show, but you may know how the song goes. MICKEYMOUSE. So music and Mickey, and it continues even more so, like the modern day Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, the singing and dancing, if you saw this when you were a kid. And as you can see here, when the Mickey Mouse Club is reinvented in the 90s, its connection to music, right? They want to find a bunch of kids who can sing and dance and all that kind of stuff. But look at what kind of an alumni group that you got coming out of there. You got Ryan Gosling, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Justin Timberlake, all just in one cast of this Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. So music and Mickey and Disney really kind of are integral together. Well, let's get back to this animation conversation that we're having. First off, what Disney does, besides necessarily telling us interesting stories and giving us characters and music, new innovations in the technology of animation. So if you've ever thought about trying to be able to do your own, think about it. If I'm going to do a flip book, I'm going to have to draw every single page. That is extremely long and laborious, and how can you speed that process up? So take a look at here. This is an early piece called what was called cell animation, and cell like cellophane or like clear plastic. And so what this is a new technique that Disney just ran with, and it really speeds up how fast you can be able to produce this. If you realize the background plate there doesn't change at all, it does not need to be redrawn, and allows the artist to be simply drawing on that cellophane piece on top of it, and you could see right through the glass on the other side. This is going to allow for more speed, more realism, and this technique that began way back in the early ages of Disney, and was pretty much the way that this is going to stay until the computer age, which changes kind of everything. But now let's go back to Walt. Walt's next big dream is he wants to do something that hasn't been done before. He wants to be able to tell a full movie, not one of these shorts. He wants to do a full story, and he decides to turn to classic movies to be able to do this. And not, sorry, classic movies, to classic fairy tales. And so the fairy tale that he decides to go, many of you probably are familiar with the one that I'm talking about. It was a story taken from Germanic folklore, one that had been around for a long time, came from the Grimm fairy tales from the 1800s. And he says, oh, I love this idea about a princess and the magical story that brought her to where she is, and she needed to be revived by a kiss. And of course, that movie is that story that he's going to create is Snow White. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. When Walt pitched this idea, he originally brought all of his the people in his studio in, and he said, "Hey," he brings them in, and he sits in front on a stage, and he does the entire story by himself, telling it as an actor, playing the different roles of the dwarves and Snow White and the Prince, to try to be able to get them on board about what this story is going to be like. And he had his employees on board, but many people were really concerned or were questioning the idea of what this was going to be because it was a massive undertaking. He ended up having to borrow tons of money to be able to do this, borrow $1.5 million. His wife even started to question if this was going to pay off. It was a huge task and a huge risk, one that had never happened before, because he wanted to be able to make an animation, not necessarily a full movie, but all color and music. This is the first that had never been done before. A lot of people thought that he was nuts and thought that this one thing was going to fail to begin with, or not necessarily come out the way that he imagined. So was the movie going to be any success? Well, he decided to pull out all the stops after it was done. He had a giant opening night gala, invited his celebrities and fans showed up. It was a giant star-studded evening. Lots of buzz about the movie, but the big question would it be any good? And so it blew people away. Children and adults both loved the story, the entire thing. They loved the music behind it, the songs, the hi ho, and the visuals behind it, something that people had never seen before. It was compelling. It was even scary too, like The Witch here. And actually in Europe, there was some theaters that actually had to put a warning as you bought your ticket, saying that children under 16 weren't allowed to see this thing because of the fear and how scary it could be for them. And so nowadays we think that Snow White had to have a rating like that. Well, it didn't have a rating, but it did because it was intense. And of course, people flocked to see this thing. It was hugely successful. Of course, ticket prices were really low, but if you adjust for inflation, basically like, how well did it do comparative because of how it came out in the 30s, it still ranks in the top 10 of the most profitable movies of all time because of how much money it brings in. Let's talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments of this movie, because it's pretty staggering. First off, he had to hire 750 different artists. Some, of course, worked more than others to be able to produce this. The incredible number of drawings. I think it was over 2 million drawings were produced for this. By the way, if you're interested more about Walt Disney, try talking to your family and do a little bit of a trip here. It's really interesting. It's not that far away. Go check out the Walt Disney Family Museum. By meaning it's not that far away. It's actually in San Francisco. And you wouldn't think that. You would think it'd be down in Anaheim where Disneyland and the Walt Disney Studios would be in Southern California, but it's not, primarily because Walt Disney's oldest daughter moved to the Bay Area, and the family has moved there, and they brought a lot of that memorabilia with them. And so it's a really, really wonderful museum that's only 2 hours away, so something kind of interesting to check out. Some other numbers and statistics about it. The cost of the film was $1.5 million. Like I said, a lot of people thought it was going to be a disaster, but it did super well. Walt Disney, they decided because of a massive success that it was, that the Academy Awards actually decided to give him an honorary award for the movie because of what it did as a breakthrough. And so they gave him one, plus of course 7 other honorary miniature statuettes for all the 7 dwarves that were in the movie. Another interesting thing is that all of the profits that had come from Snow White allowed Walt to be able to do his next big dream, which is he built a giant movie studio in Southern California. And so that movie studio is still there today on the same premises. Of course, it's evolved a bunch, but here it is, the Walt Disney movie company in Burbank, California, where it is today, which you can check out. And Snow White is still an integral piece of all things Disney. Speaking of which, if you've been to Disneyland, you may have seen it look like this, the Snow White Scary Adventure, because they're doing a big renovation about it. The ride, of course, is going to start to be able to be much more up to date with, more sound and music to be able to go along with it. Back to Disney itself. So now they start their whole studio called Walt Disney Pictures, and think about how they can produce more innovations keep coming up, like this amazing one here, to be able to give animation more depth. Think about, like, not necessarily 3D, but to get the feeling of depth there. And so a new camera is invented, and that giant thing that you can see behind Walt Disney is a camera here, and it is a thing called the multi-plane camera, which here's Walt Disney explaining a little bit himself.
Now, this is a different kind of drawing. It also came out of our school of self-improvement here at the studio. It is the blueprint of a piece of equipment designed to make cartoons more realistic and enjoyable. This is the plan for a super cartoon camera. We call it the multiplane camera. It was intended for use in our feature-length cartoons. You see, we decided for features, the camera needed improvement too. Actually, the pre-feature cartoon camera was fairly simple in construction and operation, and generally very satisfactory. The problem was how to take a painting and make it behave like a real piece of scenery under the camera. The trouble was we were photographing a flat two-dimensional background. So we set about making plans and blueprints for a new cartoon camera that would overcome this. The different elements in the scene were separated according to their varying distances from the viewer. This put the moon on a plane farthest away from the camera. With our original picture broken down in this manner, it is possible to control the relative speed with which each individual part of it moves to or away from the camera. But the moon remains absolutely still, and so it will always remain the same, neither growing nor shrinking in size. Since this new camera used many planes, we called it the multiplane camera. And here now is our same moonlight scene, the way the multiplane camera sees it. As you can see, we finally got the moon to keep its proper distance.
So pretty interesting about how to be able to create sort of depth and make these scenes more rich. Disney then is going to continue to do the same thing they did with Snow White. He's going to say, hey, I'm going to look at European fairy tales and try to build upon that. So he looks at stories like Pinocchio that you can see here in 1940, keeping the same process, and things like Cinderella in 1950, Peter Pan from 1953. And this is going to continue on and on until these kind of die off, because others, you can imagine, are going to want to get in the animation game as well. So take, for example, this. Here's another company. You know them as Looney Tunes. And so much like the early Mickey Mouse films, short stories that can go before another film. And so Looney Tunes were these short little films that would play before the movie company MGM films. And they were very popular. People loved being able to see them. Think of it today like when you see the trailer before like a Pixar film. People are excited about these short stories. But what Looney Tunes is going to do a big jump is from the 40s and 50s, they're going to start moving away from being before a film and going into a new place. And of course, this is one of the biggest of the early ones, a cat and mouse thing called Tom and Jerry. They make the jump into now to go where people are really watching a lot of entertainment. And you could probably guess what that is, and that, of course, is television. Soon, these become common in everybody's home in the 1950s and 60s. And more, the demand is like, we got to put more stuff on there than we have. So it's a mad dash to try to get more and more content. And the realization is, yeah, we need content for mom and dads, but look at the kids up front. We can focus on them. We can get them as an audience members and engaged. So let's produce content for them. And then there's two people to be able to talk about some of these early pioneers in television cartoons. Two gentlemen, one named Hanna, the other one Barbera. They team up together, and they were the ones behind Tom and Jerry, and start providing more and more shows, and a fast turnaround for some of these shows, like this one, probably one of the biggest of the television age, The Story of the Flintstones. This got so popular, so big, is that this actually premiered and was put on prime time. What prime time means is, many of you are not familiar with it, but back in the day is about when you would put a television show on, because you would have to see it live. And so your most important, the stuff that you think you get the most viewers, you would put in the evening, after dinner time. Those were the prime slots to be able to go, and no cartoon had ever been on there. So the Flintstones gets aired as a primetime show, saying that let's have the whole family sit down and watch this. The animation was actually pretty simple if you look at it. Not a lot of depth that you saw in some of those things from decades before with Disney, and the storylines were pretty simple, but it was very popular for the young and the old. More shows get produced by Hanna-Barbera, like this one, that ties into that science fiction genre that we had talked about. So here in the 1960s, you have this thing about the Jetsons, and more stuff gets produced. So take example for this one, an extremely popular one called Scooby-Doo. But now let's talk about the animation of what you're actually seeing, because reality is, it was getting worse and worse. The quality of the animation. Scooby-Doo is a great example of this. It's an extremely popular show of kids, but it shows about how, more than anything else, is about these stories. These shows can be produced really fast and really cheap and not very good. And one of the biggest reasons that really comes around here is the idea is that the show can be a vehicle for something else like this. We can sell ads for the television show, but what if you sell merchandise? And a movie in the 1970s changed everything. We've talked about it a bunch, but that movie, of course, was Star Wars. Star Wars is a game changer because in the 1970s they realized not necessarily just watch the movie, but all the stuff that goes with it. The toys, the t-shirts, the lunch pails, the collectibles, the games, everything that you want goes hand in hand with this merchandise madness. And the idea that really is that the TV show is just something that's going to propel these other things. So Scooby-Doo is a great example of this. Unfortunate that often referred to people as called the dark ages of animations. And this is the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. The animations wasn't very good. The storytelling was not very good. A lot of it was just driven by the dialogue, what people are saying, as opposed to really rich animation within there. Taking a look, for example, on that animated GIF down there of Scooby-Doo, you can see that the background is just repeating, right? There's not a lot of things that are really happening in there. But it did appeal to audiences. For kids, for example, me, this is my generation. I grew up in the dark ages of animation. I watched Scooby-Doo and many of these other things, and I look back, let's say they're an Underdog, and I have fond memories of that. And now some people are saying it's because the stories were interesting, or another piece that it could possibly be is a little thing just called nostalgia. We all look to things when you were younger, even if they were good or bad, but it's fond memories of your childhood. And so these were the dark ages of animation, though. But that wasn't necessarily the case everywhere. Take, for example, here, animation is going to hit rock bottom, but now here, there's innovation outside of the traditional world of the United States. We're going to take a look at Japan, for example, here. There's going to be an explosion of creativity in a world of animation that's going to be called anime. Which basically is just the Japanese word for animation. And it's a period right here we have in the 70s and the 80s where Japanese animation really flourishes and comes into its own. The anime that comes out is usually characterized by colorful graphics, vibrant characters, and fantastic themes. And then slowly it's going to emerge as being something popular outside of Japan, where it is today as a worldwide phenomenon. And so Japan animation starts to take off, but I really want to be able to talk about the late 1980s. So if we're in the dark ages of animation, we're starting to see Japan pick up, but there's three big things that are going to happen, and I got three little windows here to see if you can guess what they are. One has to do with televisions, one has to do with movies, and another one's about a tuxedo. Let's see all three of them. Number one, television. Let's take a look at this guy named Matt. Matt is a cartoonist in Los Angeles, and a TV show comes up to him and says, hey, listen, we want to be able to add a little cartoon in the middle of our little variety show. And he had this little comic strip that you can see over there, and they go, hey, we want to buy this. And they said, come on down and meet with us. We want to be able to see if we could be able to use this comic strip and animate it and make it into our show. And Matt's sitting there and he's literally waiting to go into this meeting, and he doesn't want to give this thing up because he likes it so much. So he's thinking, I got to sketch out a new idea for them. He's in the waiting room and he takes out his pad and he starts sketching some images and thinks, I'll make a family show. Sort of like the Flintstones a little bit, but a family. His creativity is so limited at this point that he starts to name all of the family after his own. He decides to quickly sketch and draw his father, whose name is Homer, his mother is Marge, his sisters Lisa and Maggie, and then as the main boy, he doesn't put himself. He takes the word brat, a bratty boy, and changes the words a little bit and comes up with Bart. This, of course, this person's name is Matt Groening, and he is the creator of a show called The Simpsons. The Simpsons is unbelievable. It airs in 1987. It is a worldwide phenomenon of what it does here. The Simpsons is the of it's got a lot of highbrow, like kind of a smart comedy in there that you have to know a lot of references, but on the other time, a lot of lowbrow humor as well too, which meaning sort of like, obnoxious kind of stupid jokes, and it balances both those, and it gets it in sort of this mainstream way, and it really takes hold. It was witty, but while also being vulgar. Many people saw the show and loved it. Other people thought it was really outrageous. The U.S. president at the time was doing a speech once and even called out how American families need to not be dysfunctional like The Simpsons. Like, that's pretty telling, as you are the prototype of a dysfunctional family. At the time it felt extremely irrelevant, and it mocked much of what was going on of the day. And which was a wonderful part about animation is that everything just simply reset. You don't have to change anything. There's no storylines that needed to continue. In the 30-minute show at the end of the day, Homer is still going to have his job. The kids are still going to be in the same class. The family is still going to be there. Even the baby, Maggie, has been sucking on the same pacifier and has never said a word. And this television show, everybody, is still on today after airing in 1987. It has over 600 plus episodes, and it's still going with much of the same of the original cast and when it began. Is it still as relevant as it once was? I would say no. But it does do something else. It really opens the door for so many others. If you look at a post-Simpsons world today, what we have is tons of animated television shows, not just for kids, which of course there's plenty of those as well too, but just look at some of them here, like South Park, Family Guy, BoJack Horseman. These kind of shows are really edgy. And built upon what The Simpsons did, which is, can I be smart and witty and really sort of push social norms that are out there? All right, next big change is the middle one. If Simpsons was a game changer in the late 1987, what do you think the thing in the middle is about movies? Any guesses? It's really not a game changer in terms of a brand new something crazy that was happening. It was actually more of a throwback to the past, so the way things were. And of course, this is going to be about animation. And the animation in 1989, and we're going to go back to Disney. Disney had gone into a decline. Its animated films were not very good at all. They started to turn more and more towards other things. And in 1989, everything is going to be different, because they're going to look back and say, let's try to reboot what we were doing in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Let's go back to the fairy tales. Let's go back to bringing music into our animated films, and also let's have high quality. Let's get away from sort of the low end sort of stuff that you've been seeing that are in the dark ages, and bring beautiful hand drawn animation. Can anybody guess the movie that is going to that's going to do all these in 1989? It is the fairy tale Little Mermaid. Little Mermaid comes out in 1989, and it's this new golden era for Disney. Warm and rich characters. The animation was gorgeous, and it had really catchy musical sequences that we hadn't seen in animation for quite some time. And it was a huge success. The last time that Disney had a fairy tale cartoon, by the way, if this was 1989, the last previous one was in 1959. 30 years from that particular one. That was Sleeping Beauty. And then the last time they actually even had an animated film that even made any money had been 12 years before this. To this point, how was Disney even surviving? Disney was surviving not with movies at all. And it's really odd to think about. Disney was surviving on television. They had a TV show that was doing quite well for them. And on top of that, their parks, of course, Disneyland in California, and then Disney World in Florida. are really sort of the places where they started to think this is it's going to keep us alive for a while. But Little Mermaid changes all of that. And like I said, if one thing is going to work, let's keep running with it now. And look what they decided to come up with in a short time period. So if Mermaid is 1989, then you have Beauty and the Beast come out in 1991. Aladdin comes out the next year in 92. 2 years later, you have in 94 The Lion King come out. From 89 to 94, they put 4 here. If you look at sort of the list of the greatest Disney films of all time, these ones are going to be up there for sure on their list. And they even got experimental too. So the 90s were so good, they decided to, in 1993, even try a different kind of animation, which we haven't talked a whole bunch about, which is stop motion animation. So Tim Burton does the Nightmare Before Christmas, which wasn't a huge success right when it came out, but it's had lasting power and has been a big part of one of the more successful movies in Disney afterwards. And then Disney also realized something else too, is that we got to move away from European fairy tales. One is because they're running out of those stories, and two is there's so many more stories that we need to be able to represent and tell the stories of people throughout the world. So look what they start doing. They go to the Middle East for Aladdin. They go to the Americas for Pocahontas, China for Mulan. They go down to South America, Emperor's New Groove, and try to get a representation of different things all over the place. All right, the next big step. So if we got The Simpsons was 1, Little Mermaid was 2. What was the next big thing that happened in the 1980s? Tuxedo, any guesses? Actually, well, this guy graduated from high school with a bad haircut. That was me. Anyway, sorry, bad joke. But anyway, there was another thing, and it was this. It was 1988. Here was a short film that gets created. And this was more of an experiment than anything else. This was a huge achievement because animation was being done really, really different. If the Disney was to go backwards and do some hand-drawn, rich, deep stuff, this company was trying some new things and saying, hey, can we try to be able to have a different kind of storytelling? And this would be digital, computer-generated animation. And much like how Steamboat Willie changed animation, this short that comes out in 1988 is going to forever change the future of this type of storytelling. From 1988, the success that they had in some of these early short stories, they say, we now want to do what Disney did, is let's turn this into a full movie featured, a complete film, and it's going to take them time. From this one, it's going to go all the way up. It's going to take them 6 years. And in 1995, this company, which of course you may have guessed at this point, is called Pixar, is going to release its first movie in 1995 with, much like Disney did, fingers crossed, a lot of hype about it. And the movie, of course, was Toy Story. Toy Story, just like Sleeping Beauty, will blow people away. And what's interesting, although that you would think, if you look at the reviews of the time, this was a massive game changer. The computer did the entire animation. Most of the reviews only had a little talk about that this was CG. Most of it was about the wonderful story that was told here. And much like the Disney movies before, like the people are engaged in the story, and then the animation just helps tell that particular story. From there, Pixar continues to want to be able to do rich films, and they do a very slow rollout. If I mentioned Disney doing, get some of these movies out fast, Pixar, back then and still today, moves extremely slow. And one of the reasons they move really, really slow, look at this, they have, since 1995, they have only done 22 films. Not a fast rush. Take example for Marvel. Marvel has done 23 films since just Iron Man in 2007. They bust out so many films quickly, whereas Pixar does a slow rollout. And the reason is they're trying to put story first. They put tons of time into story. They do tons of research about characters, about the world that they're living in. When they did the second follow-up movie on Bug's Life, the animators actually went out outside the Pixar studios, put cameras down into the gardens and into the vegetation to try to be able to see what life was like at a bug's eye. And so they spend so much time in trying to produce this. And what's really interesting, the stories that they create have depth. And although they're marketed to children, they are really compelling for adults. Adults find these really interesting and wonderful films. And what also that gives the idea of a rewatchable. I want to be able to see this time and time again. Now, and as for the animation, each of the movie is going to build upon a previous one. Whatever they learn from one movie, they take to the next one to help the future of animation. So take, for example, a huge leap was done with Monsters, Inc. here. You can imagine a beautiful giant furry creature like this with Sully, and as he's flowing around holding onto these doors, how do you make his fur flow? Because realizing that each piece of hair is sort of moving independently based on the forces around them. And so a lot of work was done to try to get the physics behind making the fur look super realistic, which is going to build upon in further films. And there's a wonderful example of, going back to Toy Story, is how they learned about how to try to animate probably the hardest thing of all, which is making a human face look real. And the first look at Andy, the owner of the toys as a boy here, in the first film compared to the last film, we see much better, more rich, realistic, and particularly the two things that make us really sort of feel are the eyes and the mouth. And you can see by looking at both of those, they look much more realistic as opposed to the sort of the creepy robotic on the left. And so what about animation today? Where do we stand? Animation is better than it ever has been in the past, from young to old, in the United States and around the world, from different artists who have a wide range of perspectives. And now we have countless places to watch them, not just TV or movies. Now we have YouTube and streaming services, and even on social media. Animation's here to stay. And I hope you enjoyed a little bit about this walkthrough animation about where we're at today. And hopefully be able to look at some different animated movies and shows that are out there to be able to get a little bit more of your bigger understanding of the world of animation. Thanks, everybody.